Turkey backs Syrian rebels to enforce a new de-escalation zone in Syria's Idlib. Hello, I'm Ali Mustafa with a special edition of Strait Talk from the Turkey-Syria border. Turkey has started the process of implementing one of the so-called de-escalation zones in northern Syria. It's the biggest of 4 such areas agreed between Turkey, Russia and Iran. The plan is for the Turkish military to support FSA fighters in Idlib province. Can Hassasu reports from the Turkey-Syria border.
Turkish tanks and armored vehicle amass near the Syrian border. Syrian opposition FSA fighters are being deployed for Idlib, moving under the cover of dark. Turkey is calling it a humanitarian intervention to ensure peace and stability in Idlib.
Eğer biz bu terör örgütlerine hayat hakkı verecek olursak her an bu sınırlardaki 911 kilometrelik bu sınırlarda bizim kardeşlerimiz, vatandaşlarımız tehdit altında kalacaktır.
Idlib is home to almost 2 million internally displaced Syrians who have fled fighting in Aleppo and elsewhere. And it's the largest area still in the hand of the opposition groups in northern Syria. The Idlib de-escalation zone is the result of a deal between Turkey, Russia and Iran. Under the agreement, Turkey will establish 14 observation posts in the area. Turkish forces will monitoring a ceasefire between the opposition and regime forces along a 400-kilometer de facto border. It's the second time Turkish forces have backed the Free Syrian Army. They removed Daesh from Jarablus last year while also pushing out YPG. The action stopped the YPG from creating a hostile corridor near Turkey's borders. Turkish-backed forces say they have proven themselves in the Operation Euphrates Shield, but the mission in Idlib is expected to be more challenging. Ankara wants a permanent home for displaced Syrians and for the opposition to retain a base in Syria. To carry that out, it is supporting Idlib and helping its people establish a sustainable model in their own country. And with Turkey's dual approach of using military and diplomatic pressure, thousands of Syrians will be given the safety and security they desperately need. Can Hassasu, Strait Talk.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined from London by Anders Krieg. He is a professor at King's College London. Anders, thank you for joining us. How does Turkey, Iran and Russia plan on implementing these so-called de-escalation zones in northern Syria?
I mean, there are 4 different de-escalation zones, and the Idlib one, which will be administered by Turkey, will be slightly different from the other ones. Turkey will predominantly try to build up observation points. They will try to set up checkpoints along the way to make sure that the different varying factions are not actually clashing. But doesn't mean that these are not safe havens in the way that we might be used to it under UN sanctions. So what that means is they're not trying to actually pacify these areas. They just want to make sure that the different parties are not really clashing in battle. But how are you going to implement this? I mean, the Turks will send in, their own special forces. They will have a mechanized infantry battalion coming in, but most of it will be actually done by surrogates on the ground, and the surrogates will be from the Free Syrian Army, and they will help administer this. And the Russians will provide some air cover for the Free Syrian Army as well as for the Turkish troops on the ground. The Iranians at this point will not have a role in the Idlib de-escalation zone. They will have their own de-escalation zones in the south of the country to administer. And it will be really up to the Turks in the north to make sure that this little pocket in Idlib will be securitized.
Anders, you're mentioning the various different groups. You're mentioning the former Nusra Front, now called HTS. You're talking about the FSA, which has been absorbed by other groups. Let's take a look at the various so-called terror groups that are operating in northern Syria in this report by Usman Lone.
So which terrorist groups are operating in Syria? First is Daesh, a group that gained notoriety for their brutal beheadings, suicide bombings, and attacks on civilians. Since 2013, the group is thought to have launched at least 100 terror attacks in a host of countries. Another group is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formerly known as Al-Nusra Front. Plagued with fierce infighting and showing brute force against other rebel groups, who have seized control over local facilities and are now threatening to take over Idlib. But their strength in Syria as a whole is now dwindling after a major assault led by US airstrikes. That victory has come at a cost, as American weapons were being supplied to other terrorist groups who did most of the fighting. Enter the PKK terror group, who the US also designates as terrorists. The PKK's affiliates have received considerable financial and military support from Washington to fight. The YPG and SDF's rapid gains are raising fears that the terrorist offshoots have ulterior motives. So Turkish troops have recently crossed into Syria to prevent that from happening.
So we saw that report by Usman Lone, and it details the kind of terror groups that are operating in northern Syria. You were mentioning the cyclical nature of these groups, the FSA, which is absorbed, parts of which have been absorbed by other groups. You mentioned the HTS. Tell us how this insurgency or this rebellion against the regime has played out in northern Syria as far as these groups are concerned, Andres.
I mean, yeah, we've seen ups and downs. I mean, in 2012, you know, the FSA was very much the only really potent power in northern Syria, reigning from the western part of northern Syria and all the way to the east. Now we've seen this completely disintegrated. I would say that the YPG and, you know, the SDF in general are a lot more powerful. They are ruling almost the entire northeastern part of Syria. And Idlib is a very small pocket where the FSA, we don't really know what is left of the FSA. Even HTS, you know, the group that was built as an umbrella around Al-Qaeda, is split into various different groups. FSA is split up into various different groups. And these people move between these groups back and forth. So you might have people who are with HTS now, who are you know, fighting on the Salafi jihadist side, who might have been more on the moderate side a couple of years ago. And I think one of the attempts now by Turkey is to try to separate these different groups, you know, engage the YPG, you know, what is supposed from Turkish point of view is seen as an extension of the PKK, you know, engage the Salafi jihadist groups and allow those people who have worked now with the Salafi jihadist groups under HTS to maybe move back into the FSA. So, you know, there are some people who have been very pragmatist and opportunistic within HTS who have said, you know, the FSA is not really a potent fighting force because the HTS has gotten a lot more money, a lot more support, they are better trained, they are a lot more potent, a lot more capable. So a lot of people from the FSA, seeing that they might be squashed by Russia, Iran and the regime, joined HTS. So these people from within HTS, who are more opportunistic, might actually move back now to the FSA if they see that the FSA gets the kind of support that is needed, particularly from Turkey now.
It almost sounds like a revolving door policy. You were mentioning the YPG. How much of a significant threat is the YPG to Turkey, and how is that playing into Turkey's calculus as it backs the FSA in Idlib?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Because this is the one thing that we haven't spoken about. I think as much as this is going to be a push against Salafi jihadism, pushing these Salafi jihadists towards the south of Idlib province, it's also going to be a push eventually, I think, against the YPG pocket in Afrin. And I think that's the other calculus of this Turkish operation, because yes, Turkey is going in there to help the Syrian people, but Turkey is also going in there to protect, you know, its own borders. It's a matter of national interest, as Erdogan rightly said. I mean, both the jihadists as well as the PKK pose a national security threat to Turkey. So, and the YPG is seen as part of this kind of Kurdish nexus. And I think moving in and pushing, creating a safe zone south of the border of Turkey against jihadists means also you have to create a safe zone on the southern part of the Turkish border in what is now the Afrin pocket, which is held by the YPG. And I think eventually, I think that they will use or try to use the FSA to move into the Afrin pocket to try to push out these YPG forces towards the south.
Andreas Krieg, thank you for joining us from London. Still to come on Strait Talk. We meet families trying to reunite after years of war. And we look back at the early stages of the Syrian conflict and ask if the global community could have done more to limit the violence. When you put aside all the political interests and the military considerations, Syria's tragedy is essentially a human one. Years of war have scarred a generation, and families separated by conflict are now making a perilous journey in hopes of reuniting, as Ömer Kablan reports.
Halep'teki zulümden kaçmak suretiyle İdlib'e gelen kardeşlerimizi ne olursa olsun ister ölün ister kalın diyemeyiz. Onlara biz elimizi uzatmak durumundayız ve şu anda da bu adım atıldı, devam ediyor.
Since the first shots were fired in Syria's civil war more than 6 years ago, Turkey has welcomed more than 3 million Syrian refugees. And after Operation Euphrates Shield, Turkey wasn't only giving Syrians a place to live within its borders, but a chance to live securely in their own country. And now they've initiated a new operation to ensure the same for the city of Idlib. I went to the Cilvegözü border crossing just 50 kilometers from Idlib. Here at the Cilvegözü border crossing, the situation has been pretty much the same for the past 7 years. A raging war with no end in sight and terror groups operating nearby. Syrians continue to flee for safety and security. But with Turkey's Operation Euphrates Shield a success, and now with the new operation on the horizon, Syrians hope to return to a life they once knew. It was here I met Mohammed Isa Ibrahim. He told me he's been waiting for his family here for 3 days, but because there were terror groups operating nearby, safe passage to Turkey was very difficult.
صار لي من الظهر يعني عم بستنى عائلتي مرتي واولادي على اساس انه يدخلوا اليوم ان شاء الله يدخلوا. اكيد هلا دخول تركيا على ادلب اذا حقق نجاح مثل نجاح عمليه درع الفرات الاولى هذا بيعطينا امل كبير انه نرجع.
Thousands of refugees in Hatay were forced to flee after Al-Qaeda-linked terror groups began moving into Idlib. I came across a former shopping complex that's been turned into makeshift houses. One family invited me inside their home. Abdul Ayoub has been living here for 2 years with his wife and 6 children.
حطونا بثلاث يمكن خيارات، النظام او الكراد او يدخل الجيش التركي، لا احنا فضلنا انه على امل انه نرجع اذا دخل الجيش التركي او دخل درع الفرات.
Back at the border, Mohammed gets bad news. His wife and children failed to make the journey across the border, but he's still in high spirits, hoping that areas close to the Turkish border will be safe again, and that he and his family will be able to return home in peace. Ömer Kablan, Strait Talk.
And to further discuss the humanitarian situation in Syria's Idlib province, I'm joined from Istanbul by Sinan Hatet. He's a senior associate fellow at the Shark Forum. Sinan, thank you for joining us. Now, you're originally from Syria. How are people in Idlib reacting to this Turkish-led intervention by the FSA in Idlib?
Well, thank you for having me, Ali. The local population in Idlib is mostly concerned with their safety. They have been subject for an airstrike campaign led by Russian air forces for the last 3 weeks. Some of the targets that have been targeted by the airplanes were hospitals, schools, and they feel that they could be subject for further escalation. So the Turkish intervention in this sense bring promise of stability and maybe cessation of hostilities, at least from the regime part and the Russians. But at the same time, to be honest with you, they are also very concerned with what would follow with the Astana process. How would that impact the political process? Will Bashar al-Assad stay in power or not? This is all questions that come across the people mind in Idlib and elsewhere.
So these are the broader contours, essentially, that people are concerned what will happen with these de-escalation zones. Describe to us the average life of a civilian in Idlib right now.
Well, people are mostly going through their natural routine. This has been going for the last 5 years. Of course, some of the local councils had to stop their activities in the last 2 weeks because of fear of being targeted by Russian air forces. Otherwise, people are still going to their own businesses. School teachers are still teaching, but instead of doing it up to the open or in the known buildings, they're doing it into alternative locations. People are have been used to this kind of operation now. What they're looking for is mostly to stop their strikes. And they trust Turkey, they trust the Turkish army. They've seen what is done in the Bab region, and they believe that it could eventually bring peace to them. But once again, the concern after that is what will happen on the political process. And the people of Idlib, if there is one thing they're sure of, that they don't want to be back under the rule of Bashar al-Assad.
Sinan, one reason that Turkey says it is intervening or backing this FSA-led intervention in Idlib to create this de-escalation zone is that it doesn't want to see a repeat of what happened in Aleppo with these alleged war crimes committed by Shia militias. Let's take a look at this report by Aisha Jamal that details Turkey's position on entering Idlib.
Idlib cannot become another Aleppo, a city that has seen some of the worst violence since the outbreak of the Syrian war. A recent surge of fighting across the country has made September the deadliest month of 2017. Civilians again are bearing the brunt of the suffering, with reports saying that Bashar al-Assad, backed by Russia, is striking residential areas, hospitals, ambulances, and even schools. The recent attacks have been especially intense in Idlib province. The area is also where the Syrian regime dropped sarin gas in April of this year, killing more than 80 civilians. These scenes are a reminder of the battle for Aleppo, where the city's civilians endured what the UN called crimes of historic proportion. The Syrian regime unleashed a relentless bombing campaign on civilians, which include the use of barrel bombs, a large container packed with nails and chunks of steel that is dropped from the air and has no specific target. Cluster bombs, which release hundreds of smaller bombs that can saturate a large area and would kill or seriously injure anyone it hit, and chemical weapons, which can cause mass suffocation and death in just minutes. Assad used them at least 8 times in under 1 month in the battle for Aleppo. The attacks didn't even stop for people being evacuated from the city. With aerial support from Russia and Iranian-backed foreign fighters, the regime took over the city in December of 2016, and many of Aleppo's civilians fled to Idlib. But the al-Qaeda-linked HTS took control from the opposition earlier this year. So Turkey's goal in Idlib is to establish security and ensure civilians don't suffer another humanitarian catastrophe like seen in Aleppo. By implementing the de-escalation deal agreed to in Astana and creating more safe zones, like those in Jarablus, where Turkey prevented terrorists from taking over so that Syrians could rebuild their lives.
Sinan, as we saw in Aisha Jamal's report there, Turkey says it doesn't want to see of what happened in Aleppo. Are Turkey's concerns justified over the violence in Idlib?
Yes, it is justified because Russia has made its position very clear towards the population of Idlib. They consider it as pro-Nusra, a group that has been designated by the UN Security Council as a terrorist group. And unfortunately, the resolution 2254 doesn't provide any source of security for Idlib. So the justification is solid for entering Idlib, not to see what happened in Aleppo repeating itself in the province. And this is what also the local population is very aware of, and this is why they support this operation for the time being.
Sinan Hatahed, thank you for joining us from Istanbul. The war in Syria has been the result of unimaginable violence that some argue is a result of global inaction. Many critics say that the US should have done more in the beginning. They argue that US silence led to Iran, Russia, and even terrorist groups such as Daesh, YPG, and Nusra filling the power vacuum. Courtney Keeley takes a closer look at the US's failed policy in Syria.
Nearly 7 years into one of the bloodiest conflicts since World War II. With more than 400,000 dead and over 11 million Syrians displaced inside and outside the country, the Syrian crisis continues. September was the deadliest month so far this year, with 1,000 civilians killed across the country, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. Russian and Syrian forces have launched hundreds of airstrikes after the sixth round of peace talks brokered by Iran, Russia, and Turkey concluded just last month. Bashar al-Assad and his regime, backed by Russia and Iran, are on course to regain most of the ground lost since the beginning of the war along its heavily populated western corridor. The Free Syrian Army, which has sought to overthrow the murderous regime, is overwhelmed and outgunned by Daesh and the coalition Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, dominated by formerly affiliated al-Qaeda groups. The FSA and moderate rebels were supported by a covert CIA program, which was the foundation of the Obama administration's policy to force out Bashar al-Assad. But the Trump administration's phasing out the program, something long demanded by Russia, and signaling the U.S. no longer actively seeks regime change. The Trump administration did launch missile strikes in April, targeting the regime's Shayat air base after Assad launched a chemical weapons attack in the Syrian town of Han Sheikhoun. While it was the first U.S. missile strike against the regime since the Syrian civil war began, it was not a sign of a shift in U.S. policy toward Syria. Besides its fight to dislodge Daesh, the U.S. looks likely to further chart a policy of disengagement and isolation. As the conflict grinds on, the only winners emerging out of the inhumane horrors of this war look likely to be Assad, Russia's military might, and the cementing of Iranian influence over the region. Courtney Keeley, Strait Talk.
And to discuss this further, I'm joined from Istanbul by Nursen Gune. She is the Dean of Bahçeşehir Cyprus University. Thank you for joining us. Is it fair to single out the United States for what has happened in Syria, or is the blame for the international community to share as a whole?
Well, we can say both, because what has happened so far in Syria in the last 7 years is due to the international community. They failed to give a response to what has happened at the beginning of the civil war in Syria. I'm meaning, of course, the UN General Security, how they have failed to come out a common project to respond to what is happening. We knew that the previous administration, during the Obama administration, they have accepted a new strategy, which is called Leading Behind Strategy. This has made Washington a little disengaged from the region, and that is how, from the vacuum that has come into fore in 2015, we have seen that Russia has jumped into Syria and has somehow strengthened its position, that it has lost its power and influence at the end of the Cold War year. And also the vacuum that has come into fore due to the failed state in Syria, The radical groups also fulfilled the vacuum on the ground that we have witnessed all these radical groups like Daesh and Al-Nusra. So the blame is not only on one side. We can say that international community, especially at the UN Security Council, when they have failed to reach a solution, a common objective, what to do about the Syria civil war is the main problem, I would say.
Nursin Gunay, thank you for joining us from Istanbul. And that's all for this edition of Strait Talk from the Turkey-Syria border. If you have any comments or suggestions, do share them with us at #StraitTalk. Until next time, take care and goodbye.